Interactivity is an essential part of all games. The interactivity of games is what sets them apart from other forms of traditional media, like film or literature. While audiences may feel emotionally invested or otherwise engaged with a book or a film, they don't tangibly interact with the media in any way, and the media doesn't respond to their input. This isn't the case with games. All games, digital or otherwise, require player input, and depending on the actions the players take, the system will respond. This is because we play games, and play implies interactivity. To play with a game, a toy, a person, an idea, is to interact with it. So what does it actually mean to interact with something? A simple example is a light switch. You flip it up and the lights turn on. You flip it down and the lights turn off. This is an interaction. In other words, you made a choice to take an action, providing the system with an input, and the system responded to your action. This is how interaction works in games too. Game designer Greg Kostyakoyan gives the example of playing Monopoly. You choose whether or not to buy a property you land on. The game state changes in response to your decision. The outcome of the game will differ depending on your decision. The game interacts with the players, and the players with each other, changing state as they play. Monopoly is interactive at its core. That's true of every game. If it isn't interactive, it's a puzzle, not a game. The way interaction in games differs from interaction with everyday objects is that interaction in games has a clearly defined purpose, and this isn't always the case when you're interacting with objects in the real world. It's likely that the game has provided you with at least one clear goal, to win or simply to complete the game, and the way you fulfill this goal is through interaction with the designed system of the game. You must think about the objective, think about the current game state, make a decision, and then take action. In summary, playing a game means making choices within a game system designed to support actions and outcomes in meaningful ways. Every action results in a change affecting the overall system. This process of action and outcome comes about because players interact with the designed system of the game. This kind of meaningful, purposeful interaction gives rise to player decision-making, which is usually a very good thing. A lot of the fun of playing games comes from being confronted with interesting choices, thinking about them carefully, making a decision, and then observing how the game system or the other players respond to your actions. This is especially true of strategy games like chess, where there's no randomness or role-playing, and your success relies solely on your ability to make decisions in order to fulfill your objective. Each turn presents you with an interesting choice, and you must consider all kinds of factors, like the placement of your opponent's units on the board and what units you still have left standing. Sid Meier once famously said that a game is a series of interesting choices. How's that for a game definition? Not all interaction is created equally. Part of the task of a game designer is to create a system that provides players with those interesting choices Sid Meier was talking about. Sometimes players will take action in a game that doesn't result in any notable change or response from the game system. And sometimes players will take an action that always results in the same outcome. This type of interaction isn't meaningful. It's called functional interaction. Functional interaction describes when specific player inputs are mapped to one specific outcome or output. Flicking a light switch on and off is a functional interaction, not a meaningful one. And passing go in Monopoly always gives you 200, no matter what. A meaningful interaction is when the outcome changes depending on what action the player decides to take. Most of the time, you want to create opportunities for meaningful interaction, because this results in the player being confronted with interesting choices. Meaningful interaction is engaging. Of course, there's a lot that goes into designing and building a system that presents the player with meaningful interaction and interesting choices. You must set the right goals for the player, give them challenges to overcome in pursuit of that goal, make their success seem uncertain, and provide them with a satisfying reward when they ultimately do succeed. And the player has to learn how to do all of this through interaction with the system, because it's not like you can just sit down there right next to them as the game designer and explain how everything works. The game itself must give them feedback and communicate the game state to them so that they can make informed decisions about how they want to play. Doing all of this is not simple, and it's not straightforward. In fact, the entire field of game design is trying to explore each of these elements and how to best integrate them into games. We'll talk in detail about how to build a system that encourages meaningful interaction as we move forward. For now, though, let's stick to our discussion about interaction. It's important for us to remember that we can't directly design play, nor can we control how players interact with the game system. We can only design the structures and context in which play takes place, indirectly shaping the actions of the players. So it's critical for us to ensure that the structures and context we do create for players is rich with the kind of information they need in order to meaningfully interact with the system. And one of the best ways of achieving this is through proper use of affordances. The concept of affordances is closely related to interactivity and is broadly applicable to all kinds of interactive media and not just games. The concept actually originates in the field of ecological philosophy, which considers affordances as the action possibilities offered by the environment to the animal. Design professor and researcher Don Norman took this concept and applied it to the field of design. In his book, The Design of Everyday Things, he defines affordances as the perceived or actual properties of the thing, primarily those fundamental properties that determine just how the thing could possibly be used. A chair affords is for support and therefore affords sitting. A chair can also be carried. I think the easiest way to think about affordances is simply as the set of possible actions for any given object. So, for example, consider the affordances of a mug. The set of possible actions are really endless if you want to get creative. Of course, the first ones that come to mind are the fact that it can hold liquid and be picked up by the handle. But, like most objects in the real world, the affordances of this mug are really only limited by your imagination. You could use this mug as a ball and play catch with it. You could plant flowers in it. Even if you showed a mug to someone who had never seen one before, they could probably figure out how to use it. Affordances for objects in the real world are flexible. By contrast, the affordances of digital objects are much more finite. Digital affordances are inflexible compared to real-world ones, and digital affordances must be learned. For example, take this symbol. What are its affordances? You most likely understand the affordances of this digital object or symbol, and you probably figured it out immediately. I'll just go out on a limb and say that pretty much everyone watching this video knows the affordances of this digital object. It turns things on and off. And I'll bet it's the same for this guy. We probably all know what this one means too. However, it's important for us to realize that these two digital objects and their affordances are not inherent in any way. They're arbitrary, and we had to learn what they did. We had to learn their affordances through interaction with them. Across all of our devices, basically, these symbols mean the same thing. Their affordances are the same, and thus our interactions with them are very similar. Just like we learned to speak as children and came to understand that the word dog refers to the friendly, furry, four-legged creature, so too have we all learned another language, that of digital objects and their affordances. To summarize, affordances are the set of possible actions for any given object, digital or otherwise. Affordances in the real world are nearly endless and limited only by your imagination. Digital affordances, by contrast, are designed and have a set number of possible actions determined by the designer. Thus, the affordances of digital objects must be learned, and we learn through interaction. The affordances of digital games are naturally digital affordances. While the affordances of some game objects can be pretty obvious through visual communication alone, like we all probably know what would happen if we interacted with this nice red potion here, there are going to be some affordances that players must learn through interaction with the game environment. It's important to ensure that whatever the player perceives as the affordances of a game object are, in fact, its actual affordances. It's important to ensure that whatever the player perceives to be the affordances of a game object are, in fact, its actual affordances. If you add in all of these amazing features that give players opportunities to make interesting choices and engage in meaningful interaction, but they don't perceive any of the actual affordances of your game environment or your game objects, then they're going to miss out on all of this fun stuff that your game has to offer. If you remember one thing, remember this: what is perceived is what is acted upon. Of course, the affordances of your game objects and your game environment will vary depending on the game that you're making. What's important to keep in mind is that A, your game objects have affordances. B, players must learn what these affordances are in order to meaningfully interact. And finally, C, that players are going to learn about what they can and can't do in your game environment and with your game objects through interaction. In other words, players must be given some kind of response from the game system as a result of one of their actions, even if it's something as small as regaining a few points of health after taking a health potion. We'll talk in detail about best practices for providing players with helpful feedback in another video. For now, though, the key takeaway is that if your player understands what everything does, if the affordances of the game environment are clear and they've learned what they are through interaction, then they have all of the information and context they need to make interesting choices in pursuit of their goals. Interactivity is an essential element of all games and distinguishes them from other forms of popular media. On a basic level, interaction describes the process of providing a system with an input and receiving a response or output. We learned about two types of interaction: functional interaction and meaningful interaction. We want to create opportunities for meaningful interaction between players and the game system as game designers. Since we can't directly design play, one of the best ways we can encourage meaningful interaction as game designers is through the appropriate use of digital affordances. Affordances are the set of possible actions for an object, and since digital games use digital objects with digital affordances, players must learn what they can do within a game environment through interacting with it. If players understand what they can and can't do within a game, they are one step closer to experiencing meaningful interaction instead of just functional interaction, and thus they're one step closer to having a very fun time playing your game.